Hello and welcome to this presentation. My name is Lita McDaniel. I'm a physical therapist in Atlanta, Georgia, orthopedic clinical specialist, and currently I'm serving as the chair of the social media committee for APTA Georgia. I'm really pleased to be with you for this guest lecture on social media use in physical therapy, a look at best practices. So thanks and look forward to being with you all. So the objectives for today, my goal is for you all to get a greater understanding of the potential uses of social media by our physical therapy governing bodies, so specifically the APTA and our Georgia chapter of the APTA. I want to discuss really best practices in regards to three things surrounding social media use. So legality, ethics, and professional use, and trying to evaluate those different domains as we think about different potential uses in physical therapy of social media, because it is or could be such a powerful tool. So I want to get you all practicing those decisions with the use of case scenarios, and we'll kind of do that in an asynchronous way, but I'll guide you through that as we go. So as we go, in certain slides, I'm going to have you pause the presentation so that you can write down some of your answers and really think through some of these scenarios. And is it legal? Is it ethical, professional? And what would you do if you were placed in the role of decision maker for that? I'd also like to interject some potential uses of social media and physical therapy that you might not know about or might not understand certain value of. So talk about that as well. So first thing I want to do is just debrief some of the survey responses that you provided to me. So I really appreciate those of you who took the survey, and this is how you've reported that you engage in social media. And we're going to compare this to the general American public so that you get a sense for how social media is being used and what the power of it is, and which platforms are maybe more of use or more popular. So for your class, the students who responded, which was 43, I'm not sure your exact class size, these are the responses. And so as you can see, most popular will be Instagram, followed by Facebook, and then Snapchat, it looks like. So those are kind of your top three for your class. How often do you engage in social media use? So about a quarter of you spend 30 minutes or less. Vast majority of you, 2/3 approximately, spend 1 to 2 hours on social media. So that's quite a bit. So as you can see, if you are indicative of some of the other general population, at least your age and demographics representative, quite a bit of time every day spent on social media use. And about 15% of you, thank you for being honest, use social media over 2 hours a day. So it's quite a bit of time. And responses to this particular question: do you think social media has a place in the physical therapy profession? The percentages that agreed and said yes for these first three uses are on the right. So for governing bodies, like I said, we're going to talk about that. So the majority of you agreed. For physical therapy businesses, you agree it has a use. For public health outreach, you agree it has a use. For physical therapists and PTAs, for your own continuing education as you become a PT and interact with PTAs, 47% of you thought that that would be an appropriate use. So less than half of you think that that might be appropriate. Check marks on the left. What I'd like to argue is that all of these potential avenues could be ways to engage in appropriate ways in the physical therapy profession with social media use, and continuing education is one of the things that I might promote. So we'll talk about that. It might not be what you think of as certified CEUs. However, you can gain a lot of information if you are careful and kind of cultivate and sift through certain social media platforms, know what to look for, and you dig a little bit based on credentials of the author, and also citations. If the site is promoting certain claims for effective treatments or diagnostic techniques, you're always going to want to look for citations, just like you would evaluate other forms of evidence, journal articles, videos, potentially textbook sources even. So that we're going to talk about, but I'd like to try to convince you that that could be an effective use for yourself as a student physical therapist, but then also entering into the profession. So how is social media used for the general population in the United States? Pew Research Group did a survey in 2021, and here's kind of what they came up with. So pretty recent survey. And this is true for American adults. Most popular platform that we see within the US for adults is actually YouTube. So it's different than what your class rated quite a bit. About 80% of individuals have used YouTube. Facebook comes in at a close second. And then as you can see, Instagram is a third. And we have kind of a tie, so to speak, pretty close within 20 to 30% of people are using these other platforms of social media. So just to give you a sense for with general American public, how they're engaging and what platforms are most popular. As you can see with this graph, the representation is that social media use is increasing. We have a little bit of a taper off or a plateau within or between 2018 and 2020 towards the right of the graph, but you can see just such a steep increase, and the majority of Americans are using this and engaging in social media quite a bit. So it is important. This is just to reinforce the idea that this could be a really neat way to engage with the general public. Again, this is showing the frequency of use. Facebook, majority of users are going to use it daily. You'll see that kind of in between section would be weekly and then less frequent, the dark gray on the right. But as you can see, the majority of these platforms, individuals who use social media are likely using it more than half the time. So with the exception of Twitter, you can see most users are using it daily, or half the users are at least using it daily. That's the frequency. Sorry, I misspoke on that one. So again, quite a bit of social media use, majority using these platforms daily. So it's a captive audience if you are able to leverage this type of information exchange. Fun facts about social media. These are just putting some numbers on it. So about 70% of Americans do use some form of social media. This age group of 18 to 29-year-olds, the percentage grows higher, so about 85%. And you can see kind of the percentages that are used within that age group in that next bullet, and the majority do so daily. So we already talked about that. Why do we want to discuss social media? I think I've already referenced this, but as we get into some of the decision-making and the clinical scenarios, we want to really be careful and understand that yes, social media can be a powerful tool because we have this captive audience and because there is such widespread use, but it can also be a dangerous weapon. And what I mean by that is that in most platforms, the posts that you generate and send out into the interwebs, into the wide world, it's not easy to take them back and erase them. And so thinking of that as somewhat of a permanent record, hopefully I can convince you that social media is worthy to be used, but you still want to take a careful hand in sifting through and editing the potential posts that you generate, just so that they're not ill-received and so that they do meet these criteria of being legal, ethical, and professional. And that's really important as you enter the profession and really take on this accountability and responsibility of yourself as a healthcare professional. So here are scenarios. Without further ado, these scenarios I'd like you to get familiar with. So feel free to pause the recording. I'm not going to read them to you word by word. I trust in your ability to do that. But we have these 3 scenarios, and I'm going to guide you through the decision-making process, but I'd like you to become familiar with potential use of social media from a student physical therapist, potential use in the second scenario from a physical therapist posting on Twitter, and then a clinical regional director who is a physical therapist, but is acting in more of a managerial or administrative role in as a PT clinic director for a chain of physical therapy clinics. So take a second, pause the recording. Please read these scenarios. You can underline, jot notes if you'd like to. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to get through what these scenarios are and what the setup is, what I'd really like you to start thinking about, and if you have a printout of this or a tablet that you're following along with, I'd really like you to write down notes to these questions. And we'll talk about these in a little bit more depth, but I want you to start thinking about, is this particular scenario, is this a legal action or use of social media? Is it legal? Why or why not? Is it professional? Why or why not? And then is it ethical? Why or why not? Finally, what I'd like you to start doing is putting yourself in the shoes of these different actors for the scenarios and really asking yourself, would you consider writing this post? Maybe you would in the past, but as we step through this, maybe there are some reasons why you would not. Or conversely, maybe this isn't something you had ever thought about, but reading about it and just the example of it makes you think that, yeah, this is something that I'd like to do in the future as I engage in social media in my professional career and role. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the ethics of social media use, and we're going to use some of these core guiding documents from our physical therapy governing bodies. So I'll talk to you about those in this next section. And these documents that I would like you to reference are the APTA Code of Ethics. So I believe you have a copy of that. I really like you to pull that up. I'm going to show certain principles on these next slides, but it's not going to be all comprehensive. I'm going to show the principles. I'm not going to show the underlying tenets that belong to those principles. So you really need a copy of that Code of Ethics. I also want you to have for reference what we in short language or a nickname is called the guide. So the American Physical Therapy Association Guide for Professional Conduct. What this does is this helps utilize core values that we have within our physical therapy profession to apply the Code of Ethics to different scenarios. And that's what we're trying to do in the scope of social media. The other thing that I want you to use, which you probably don't have, I would be very surprised if you did, is the APTA Georgia, our chapter of APTA here in the state of Georgia, are specific social media guidelines that we utilize within our social media committee. So it is a committee, it's a group of individuals that try to decide and generate posts for our social media channels for different reasons and rationale. We'll get to that. So I'm going to share with you some of our guidelines that we utilize in our posting to try to keep our posts above board. So we want them to be legal, ethical, and professional, as we've talked about. So here are, I'm going to present you with the core principles from the Code of Ethics. Again, I don't need to read these to you. Hopefully you've had these presented to you and you have this copy in front of you right now. All I would like to do as I show these is I want you to have reference for them within the slideshow and the PowerPoints and notes for this. But what I'd also like to do is start highlighting certain principles that might apply to our social media scenarios. So in the case of these first four, I'd like you to really think about number 2, physical therapists being trustworthy in addressing the rights and needs of patients and clients. So we'll talk about that. And that has some implications as far as legality and patient privacy. And principle 3, this one is pretty obvious. We want physical therapists to be accountable for making professional judgments. So this goes along with professionalism. The next 4 core principles, I'd really like to highlight principle 7, which physical therapists shall promote organizational behaviors, business practices that benefit patients, clients, and society. So I want you to think about that a little bit, and we'll discuss in more depth how social media could set us up for promoting or benefiting our patients and clients, and then society as a whole and public health as a whole. So that's something I'm really passionate about, and I think our profession has been proactive about and passionate about in the last decade. And I would really like to hope moving forward that we can generate some really positive things for society if we leverage and we utilize this platform in responsible ways. So starting to think about that and highlighting that principle. Here are, again, the 7 core values that are promoted from the guide. So accountability in terms of social media, what that means is if you post something, taking responsibility for it, taking responsibility for the content of it, if there are errors in it, if unfortunately you realize that might not be the most appropriate use, trying to remedy that. Second core value, altruism. As I've mentioned prior, we can leverage social media, hopefully, to benefit society and benefit our patients. And how can we utilize social media? We'll come up with some examples and where this fits in a little bit later, but would there be a place for advertising or some sort of pro bono physical therapy? How can we link that to our use of social media? Compassion and caring, excellence, integrity. These things also are going to guide what we post in the content of our posts. Professional duty, so that comes back to professionalism, and then social responsibility. So how do we engage within this social media as a communication tool? What is our responsibility to the general public for educating about what we do and potentially leveraging, again, I don't mean to overuse that, but I really think it's important that we engage in this platform and we don't just let it fall to the wayside, because it's such an important thing that we can utilize in the technology that we do have. So I want you to start thinking about how these values can help you apply the ethical principles to the scenarios that I had you read. Okay, so now I want to get into some content that you're probably not familiar with. These are the social media guidelines that we utilize within the Georgia chapter. I'm not going to read words to you, but I'd like to highlight a few things. So one of the things within this preamble to our guidelines that I think is really important to highlight is that social media is rapidly changing. So this is kind of the last sentence and what it highlights. And these are our guidelines and our best practices from the best of our ability right now at this point in time. It does not mean that these won't continue to evolve as social media evolves and as our engagement as physical therapists, but also as US citizens, as users of social media across the world. So as we seek to engage in social media in different ways, personal and professional, as social media adapts and different platforms arise, these guidelines might have to be adapted. It's basically what this sentence says. And I think that's important to acknowledge, is that these things are constantly evolving. So we want to engage in them, we want to utilize them, but we also want to be careful that as they evolve and the different methods evolve, that might change how we engage, and it might change the type of content or the appropriateness of content for different channels or platforms. So that's something to think about. Okay, so here are the first few guidelines that we will utilize within our chapter that guide our posts to social media. So we want them to be ethical, we want them to be professional. Those are the top two that you'll see under this. And I think I've already reinforced how important those are. We're going to see how those might apply to these scenarios. Third principle, we want to make very certain that we're de-identifying client or patient information as that aligns with our HIPAA privacy rules, unless, of course, that patient has released an image, a name that's linked to some sort of treatment outcome, diagnostic, whatever it is. We want to make sure that there's a signed consent for release if we are posting identifiable pictures or information on social media outlets. That is super, super important. Fourth principle is also really important. So as we're engaging in social media, what you'll see a lot is, for example, on Facebook, there's the capability to share other people's posts of information. And what we want to be really careful about in our professional use of social media is this concept called verification before amplification. So we want to do our due diligence to acknowledge or test the veracity or the truthfulness of that content before we put it out there to our social media audience. So we want to make sure it's true. We want to make sure also that it is legal, ethical, professional before we just go ahead and share it or go ahead and send it along. It's particularly important if there's a citation involved. We want to make sure that content is actually coming from that citation. So cover your story, so to speak. Do your research. Really figure out where is that content coming from. Can I trust it? Is it reputable? And do I want it linked with my name and my professional interest? Because as you post, even if it's something that you're sharing from another source, ultimately you're responsible for the things that you generate and that are linked with your social media accounts. So be careful with that. That might be a sticking point rather that you might not have considered. If you're generating new content, oftentimes it's a little bit easier to think about, is this true? Where are my sources? But if you're reposting, that's equally important to check your sources, check the truth, make sure there isn't any vulgarity or discriminatory language or content. Okay, so I kind of foreshadowed the next few principles here, and these are probably a little bit more obvious principles. So we don't want our content to be discriminatory in any way. We don't want it to be derogatory towards any group, race, ethnicity, color, sex, age. We want it to be kind of equal opportunity, and we want it to be fair and positive treatment and language towards all humanity. So we don't want it to discriminate as far as groups go. That is something that we want to be really careful about. We don't want to endorse things that are illegal. We also don't want to endorse drugs, alcohol, drug-related products. We are not qualified to promote those or prescribe those within our scope of practice, nor do we want to be posting about those in social media. It's inappropriate, not even under the guise of humor or sarcasm. Those things are not very well communicated in social media language or the written word, because there's no way to inject a tone to that. And if they are misinterpreted, there's too great a risk for there to be negative consequences. So we don't want to even have any chance that that could come back, that could be interpreted in as our promotion of those things, or as it comes back to the discriminatory practices. We don't want to ever post something that could be interpreted as derogatory. We don't want to violate copyright or trademark. That comes back to the legality of our posts. So if we are utilizing information that comes from textbook, journal article, things like that, we always want to cite our sources. We want to make sure that's legal, and any trademark material that we're giving due credit for that, or we're checking with the author to make sure that that's okay to repost. We don't want to post anything that's misleading or false. So we always want to check our sources. We talked about that. All right, anything that's controversial or profane, we definitely don't want to utilize. We want to do the best that we can to use proper grammar and punctuation. This is a little bit hard, especially on platforms that limit characters such as Twitter. However, we do want to the best of our ability, utilize language that is able to be interpreted in the appropriate ways. And so utilizing proper grammar helps with that communication. We want the next, or the last two tenets have to do with the fact that the posts that we create as an APTA Georgia social media committee and put out into social media are then the property of APTA Georgia, and they represent our association. So again, we have this really heavy due diligence and responsibility that those posts are appropriate and relevant to the missions of our APTA chapter here in Georgia. So I take that very seriously, and our committee takes that very seriously. And so we really make sure that everything that we post has been checked and edited by a couple people, and that it is aligning with the values and these guidelines that we've come up with as a committee and as an organization, actually trying to oversee our committee and help us post in ways that really communicate with our members well, communicate with the general public well, and do so in professional, ethical, and legal ways. Okay, so all that being said, those are different ways that we can guide the use of our social media practices within physical therapy. What I'd really like you to do is I want you to come back to these scenarios. I want you to pause at each of these next 3 slides, and I really want you to use those guiding documents to come back to these answers or come back to these questions and then the answers that you've generated to make decisions on these different scenarios. And I don't just want you to say, yes, it's legal. I want you to say why not, and really comb through some of these guiding documents, because as you engage in social media, I would like you to have these documents to refer to guide your decision making. That's really the whole point, is I want to take you through this decision making process so that you have that available to you as you utilize social media within your professional lives as physical therapy students and ultimately physical therapists. I think it's really important. So take some time. This is the first scenario. You have some blank spaces to write on, but really try to come up with, is this legal, professional, ethical? Why not? Utilize those documents, please. So this slide for the student physical therapist scenario. I'd like you to pause the recording, do the same thing for the second scenario for the physical therapist who posted on Twitter. And then again, please pause the recording and utilize that same decision-making framework for this third scenario for the regional director. Okay, so this slide is just kind of as a recap. You can jot down some of your answers onto this if you'd like to see them all in one place. And I promise we will come back to these, we'll discuss these and some of the principles that I use for my decision-making. If you have different principles, doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but we'll kind of evaluate these scenarios that you spent some time on. So this is just a slide where you can put your notes, you can pause for a second, and then we'll get into a few more things. The second PowerPoint recording is where we're going to discuss the scenarios and principles that apply to different scenarios. So you don't get the answers until the second PowerPoint. Just kidding. Okay. Next few things I want to talk about are from APTA, so overarching social media use recommendations. And I am not privy. I imagine that APTA has their own social media guidelines as they post. These are some recommendations, and this is an article that they posted on their website to try to help guide use of social media within physical therapy. And some considerations that they bring up, a lot of these highlights dovetail very nicely or reinforce some of the concepts that we have already talked about, but there are a couple that are important to mention, and that's why I'd like to cite this. I also like to cite this article because it gives you reference for how our overall governing body views social media and recommends that we engage with it. So want it to be legal. We talked a lot about that, ethical, professional, HIPAA in regards to patient privacy, and verification before amplification as relates to the Georgia chapter guidelines. Accountability. So you should know this is not only accountability to those standards that we mentioned, but you should know and you should become familiar with the policies of social media that are set by your employers, if you're employed as a physical therapist or PTA, your educational institutions, so Georgia State Physical Therapy, Georgia State as a university, but also the physical therapy department, or your clinical training sites as a physical therapy student. So these organizations might have stricter or more lenient social media policies than other guidelines. So for example, APTA is not going to regulate your social media use unless you are legally, ethically, or professionally kind of breaching some of your physical therapy scope of practice. However, your educational institution, Georgia State, may have more stringent guidelines for how you engage with social media. So it's your responsibility to know those guidelines, know those rules, and follow them accordingly. So as you go out on clinical sites, that's important. As you're a student engaging in social media, especially if you're using it for professional use or as a student physical therapist, even in your personal use, I would recommend that you're careful in what you post and how you engage with these platforms. Really want to recommend that, and this I really like from APTA, they've put this in here because it is something that happens quite a bit, is really want you to be thoughtful and patient when you engage in social media. So oftentimes it's part of the, I think, draw of these platforms is that sometimes there is provocative content on them that can draw you in to an argument or some sort of position, whether it be political, whether it be discussing physical therapy best practices or evidence or things that other health professionals utilize as treatment or diagnostic techniques that you agree with or maybe you don't agree with. I think it's really important to reinforce that as we engage with these platforms, avoid posting impulsively. So if you get angry and you post right away and you just send it out there, like I said prior, it's very hard to take that back. So really kind of sitting with that, just like you might not send an email when you're angry to your boss, to your coworker. Social media is similar. So take some time to sit with it, make sure that communication is really what you want to communicate, and acknowledge that it's going to be out there, and the backlash from it or the after effects from it might not be what you intend. So be careful and try to predict or try to make sure that those after effects are what you intend as well. Risk management, that is pretty self-explanatory. Some of that reinforces what I just mentioned as far as being kind of thoughtful and not acting impulsively or out of anger or an emotional reaction, emotional post. APTA also, to their credit, starts to mention and starts to encourage the use of social media in these positive ways. So using it for networking, using it for building your brand, and acknowledging that these are powerful platforms, as I've mentioned prior. We are going to talk about the potential uses for social media. So have to start with all the rules, have to start with all the precautions, because those are important as we protect our professional identity and the identity of our association. However, what I really want to get excited about is ways that you can engage with these platforms in really, really positive ways to communicate with other healthcare professionals, to network. It's really quite cool and quite powerful, the communication that we can build and just the relationships that you can build within social media. And I've had such great experiences that it gets me really excited about the future of use of social media and what you can really do with it in physical therapy. So without further ado, this again is an article that starts to mention how we can leverage, how we can use physical therapy within the technology age that we're in. So we have all these amazing ways to engage with our technology. We have all these platforms that have been built for information exchange. And so what this article really highlights, and the quotation that I have here, is that in order to be relevant within our society, within our community, and as we've seen the community engaging in social media to a great extent, physical therapy practice needs to really respond to our patients' needs and expectations and the public's needs. And so what we might find is that, as presented in this article, the majority of individuals in our society who are internet users, so have the capability and the access to this, are going to seek out health information online. So if you are not online and putting out content in these different platforms, you might miss the ability to engage with these individuals. And as you know, probably from interacting with social media in different places, there are many health claims out there. Some of them are not so good. So we really have the opportunity to educate the general public and potentially influence public health in a positive way by engaging in these platforms and educating about what do physical therapists do? What can they offer to your overall health? Physical therapists can be advocates for other healthy lifestyle behaviors, such as exercise, positive nutrition behaviors, positive sleep behaviors, positive mental health approaches. Even though we are not nutritionists, even though we're not psychologists, we can engage in promoting healthy lifestyle behaviors as long as we're careful about the claims that we make and the knowledge that we claim to possess. So we still want to work and act within our scope of practice as physical therapists. But I think what we start to see, and this article kind of reinforces this, is that we can be positive influencers of health if we engage in social media in the perfect way. So that's really quite cool. And I think it is falling on us as a responsibility to use these potential channels and not just ignore them as health professionals. So I want to talk a little bit about how our organizations and our governing bodies use social media. And this is going to be quick, but I really would like you to give you examples of how some of the branding takes place within these organizations and just examples of the posts that I've helped generate within our local chapter, and then some of the campaigns that our overarching governing body is piloting, and potential channels for you to look out for, but also for you to be involved in. So pretty cool. We want to take pride in our profession. So just some examples of social media use within these two governing bodies. APTA has Facebook, Twitter, it's not shown on here, but I believe they have Instagram, they have YouTube. As a Georgia chapter, we are involved in Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, we have Instagram posts, we also have a YouTube channel. So all of those potential information sources or engagements in the social media platforms. Again, this just reinforces some of the social media accounts and ways that we engage as a local chapter, APTA Georgia. And even to highlight how important social media is, these are some tenets from our strategic plan for the years 2020 to 2022. And I have yes over there. I'm excited about our association and our chapter really enhancing the use of social media and embracing this as a way to engage our membership, as a way to market and potentially increase our membership within this chapter, because it helps more members we have, the better we can utilize those membership fees for campaigning for physical therapy, different physical therapy related causes, legislation, all of those sorts of things. And the information exchange, the networking, the continuing education we're able to provide, I believe is all enhanced by an increased membership. And some of the messages to members and some of the marketing can come about via social media. And we can also use it, and we have, as a way to communicate about conferences that are local, and also post about some of the messages that our overarching APTA will post about, such as the Combined Sections Meeting Conference, the next conference, other potential sources of free continuing education or paid continuing education through APTA. So all those things I think are quite important. Little thought on, or a little bit of a discussion on branding here. So as we put out posts as APTA Georgia, and this has come about over the last year as I've been involved, first as a committee member and then stepping into the role of chair as the need was there. We've developed as a committee different templates that we utilize for our posts so that the color scheme is consistent with our branding, so that the logo is consistent with our trademarked brand and logo. And these are some examples of those templates, so that we're not just picking brand new color schemes and we don't change our logo from what it is. So that just helps with our brand recognition and consistency of posts. These are some examples of some of our posts. So information about potential. So the first one is Neurosymposium. We posted about local conferences, posting about call for committees, so committee members, elections within our chapter. We've also had posts for other continuing education opportunities. Like I said, passing along posts that are appropriate from APTA, all those sorts of things are examples of how we utilize social media in our different accounts. APTA examples of social media use. So the logo at the top is just another example of branding, as are these other two graphics. The one in the middle just shows the centennial logo. So in 2021, we celebrated APTA's centennial, and a lot of those events were live, recorded, virtual, Zoom, so all different formats. And the majority of them were advertised among at least one social media platform. So that was quite cool. There was really this widespread engagement in the centennial celebrations, and a lot of that was promoted on the social media channels. So really, really neat use of social media. Another campaign from the APTA is the Choose PT campaign, which seeks to educate the general public about what physical therapists do and how they can help enhance their health, but also advocate for physical therapy as a first-line provider. So choosing physical therapy first is one of the messages that campaign seeks to generate and promote. So having us be a first-line provider to screen for other healthcare needs, refer out for other healthcare needs, but then address really the movement needs, the musculoskeletal and neuromuscular, potentially diagnoses, and ultimately treatments for the appropriate patient client population. So some of those things have been within this Choose PT campaign, which again has used social media platforms to a great degree. Okay, so this is the fun part. These are kind of 5 examples and 5, I think, key areas that we can think about using social media professionally within physical therapy. So how can we use these platforms? I'm excited about it. We've talked about ways that we want to be careful about it, but how can we actually use them? So here are 5 ways. One would be for continuing education resources and networking. One would be for public health outreach, which I've referenced a little bit, but I want to give you another idea of and some examples. Another would be for our organizational bodies to communicate within the profession, as far as continuing education goes, or conferences. We've kind of mentioned some of that. And then the last 2, we haven't mentioned as much, but these are more private sector. So we can use social media if we're in a private physical therapy clinic. We can use it as part of responsible marketing for our clinic. And we can also use it as responsible marketing for physical therapy related businesses. Those could include potentially health promotion behaviors that don't necessarily fall under the scope of physical therapy coding and billing. So for example, a physical therapist who leads Pilates classes within a physical therapy business, or a physical therapy practice that offers running gait assessment as a cash pay option could be important. Sorry, I advanced before I wanted to, but anyway, we'll get into some of those examples, but those are some of the things I want you to start thinking of. So this next slide I'm super excited about. You take nothing more away from this presentation, but I hope some of this has stimulated some thought. I really, really want you to think about social media as a resource for learning. Obviously, you have to kind of, like I said, really evaluate the quality of the content. We want you to evaluate the truthfulness of it before you send it on, but we also want you to evaluate the content as you are consuming it for potential continuing education. But as a PT and PTA, as a student physical therapist or student physical therapy assistant, these social media channels can provide so much information, from exercise ideas, as you can see in that picture, kind of some higher level exercise prescription and recommendation. These are a couple kind of niche groups that I will follow. So Eric Cressy puts out some really nice social media content on sports related physical therapy. Shift Movement Science is Dave Tilley's handle on Instagram, and I believe he might have Facebook as well. He has a podcast where he puts out a lot of physical therapy content as relates to gymnastics. So he's kind of specialized within that patient population, but his continuing education and a lot of his free content via those social media channels is quite cool. This Instagram square that you'll see with the logo, that's the Prehab guys. So they have quite a bit of free content, both in podcast format and exercise prescriptions that fit well within physical therapy treatment plans. And then these other 2 top graphics are Facebook groups that I would recommend you check out. The one on the right is Doctor of Physical Therapy Students. So that's a really cool thing to be involved with as a student, but also physical therapists will post on their resources for students. So whether it's study resources for your board exam, discussions about how to negotiate contracts, all sorts of things you will find on there and threads on there. So that can be quite useful if you have a question about being a physical therapy student or some of the things that tend to arise as you go through physical therapy school. That's a really, really cool resource. The PT to PT referrals is something that I would recommend you check out. Hopefully it's still there in some form when you get out and start practicing as a physical therapist. I have utilized this. So this group is fantastic if you have a patient who is moving to a different state, or you have a student athlete who is going home for the summer and they're moving, or they're not done with their physical therapy plan with you, but they're leaving. So when that happens, we want to transition our patients and get them the best care. We're in this helping profession for a reason. We really care about what we do. So if I have a patient like that, I really want to make sure they end up with a good PT. So within that Facebook group, what you'll see is, and what I've done quite a few times, is I'll say, I have, and I de-identify the post. So I'll say, I have a student athlete who is a soccer player. He is 10 weeks out of ACL surgery, but he's moving to your city. Who treats a lot of ACL patients, and who can I set him up with to continue his physical therapy plan? So we have an age, we have no name identifiers, and we have kind of what we're looking for. And that is a fantastic way to get hooked up with a good physical therapist for this person. I can say, hey, look, is it okay if I post in this group? I'm not going to identify you. Whatever comes out of that, I'm just going to send you some resources. It's a really nice way to use social media, and I love that group. I've used it quite a bit. So coming back to our idea of core values, this principle number 6 comes from the Code of Ethics. And I really want you to think about social media through this lens of using it to enhance your expertise, being a lifelong learner, using social media for some of your continuing education. Even if you don't get official CEUs, you can learn so much from the vast knowledge base of other physical therapists in these different kind of social media areas. Also wanted to highlight underneath this tenet is that we take responsibility for professional development within different avenues of healthcare delivery, and also using technology. So it fits within our code of ethics to engage in this way. The next one would be the use of social media for public health, communication, and education. So number 8 from our code of ethics is that as PTs, we really want to participate in efforts to meet health demands locally, nationally, globally. So we want to be serving our general public in the best of our ability for their healthcare needs. And part of that is potentially providing services for low income or underserved populations. Social media may not in and of itself reach these populations. However, one thing that we can use social media for would be potentially to advertise a pro bono physical therapy clinic. So if we're trying to recruit physical therapists to offer those services, if individuals have access to social media, we could advertise for an actual event. So it could be something like a blood pressure screening. It could be a balance screening, falls screening. It could be free exercise classes. It could be a free lecture on what physical therapists can offer for your healthcare needs. All different things that we can use social media for outreach to the general public. So these are just a few ideas. I'm sure you have many more, but as you can see, I believe that it's really part of our social responsibility and duty to engage in these potential ways. Another thing, and I've mentioned this a lot, what are some ways that our organizational or governing bodies can use social media? So in order to fulfill professional obligations, we want to abide by not only the local laws and regulations. If we're practicing in Georgia as physical therapists, we want to make sure that we're up to speed on what those laws and regulations are that guide our scope of practice, but also guide our billing practices and all of those sorts of things. And we want to abide by the federal laws that are put on us. So just again, treating within our scope of practice and being aware of those. And part of the use of social media from these governing bodies is to make us as physical therapists aware of those different laws and regulations, and then any changes in those laws and regulations. So one example that I can think of that was pretty recent was within the COVID-19 pandemic, telehealth became a lot more widespread, and some of the laws surrounding physical therapists' use of telehealth and ability to bill for telehealth as a covered service changed quite rapidly. So being able to have communication of those rule changes on these social media platforms just allowed for a greater dissemination. So more quick dissemination of that information more quickly and also more easily accessible. So that's something to kind of be aware of, is not only the laws as they are now, but any changes that come about. It's really nice to kind of be checking the APTA social media and also APTA Georgia. We try to make those announcements and make sure that those are able to reach our members so that they're able to adjust their practice as laws and regulations change. All right, so these last two potential uses are, again, marketing uses for private businesses within physical therapy. So you could advertise for physical therapy services. It could be cash-based services. It could be an insurance model for a physical therapy practice. It really, you can have uses of social media for either. We want to make sure that physical therapists are using these social media platforms. So under tenet number 7 in the Code of Ethics, that they're seeking payment that's deserved and reasonable. So that's kind of one of our ethical guiding frameworks. So if we're marketing, we want to make sure that we're not gouging. We're setting our prices with a reasonable frame. And then educating as well to the members of the public about the benefits of physical therapy. I've talked about this in terms of kind of our social responsibility, but it also comes back as we're marketing for our clinics, like, what can physical therapy do for you? Why would you pay for our services? That can be part of a marketing plan or marketing scheme. And then also physical therapists disclosing any financial interest that they have in products or services that we're recommending. So even if you're marketing for a business, making sure that the claims you're making for a potential product that you're selling as part of your physical therapy business, making sure that those are ethical claims. So you're not claiming that you're, for example, wobble board for balance can cure Parkinson's. Like, that's not a scientifically based claim, and that can be harmful. So we want to make sure that, yeah, you're doing the best you can to sell your product and make a living or keep your practice open, but you're not doing that with false claims or gouging prices. All right, the last little bit I wanted to show you are, these are some of the ways that I engage in social media. So these are my uses of social media for some of my physical therapy kind of passion projects. So free resources that I have created and try to update and keep current are, I have a physical therapy related blog with physical therapy related content. It's not a paid thing. You can go read it at will. If you like it, please let me know. I would get a kick out of that. But really what it's meant for is a resource for other physical therapists or individuals within the physical therapy profession. I'm kind of a research nerd, so my blog posts you'll see have many citations and references at the end. Doesn't mean you have to agree with what I'm posting, but that's just how I seek to engage in one ways in social media. Another thing I have is a YouTube channel where I've created videos, free content. Some of it is studying videos for the board exam. Some of it is technique videos, for example, how to perform certain manual muscle tests or neurodynamic tests for treatment. And it's really meant as a resource. As I've created some of that content for some of my teaching roles, what I've decided to do is just make that open for the general public as they feel like it's useful. It's me kind of trying to share my knowledge in physical therapy because I am excited about it. I really love this profession and I do love teaching. And so those are ways that I can kind of engage with other members beyond these lectures and some of my teaching roles as an adjunct faculty, as an adjunct professor at Emory. One thing I also have is a paid resource, and this is a business that I helped start with my business partner just last year in 2021. And our business is called OCS Overhaul. I will promote it for you, but it's just an example of one of the ways that I use social media. So we have a website, we advertise on Facebook, Instagram, those sorts of things. And what we're trying to do is we're just providing tutoring services and resources if you are in that small population of individuals who are physical therapists studying to try to gain that orthopedic clinical specialty. So they're trying to study for that specific exam. So it's pretty niche, but that's what we've tried to create in our business. Again, it's kind of a passion project. So this is me. I really thank you for your attention, and hopefully this lecture has been somewhat enjoyable and informative for you. Please feel free to get in touch with any questions, and I will see you in the second PowerPoint just to discuss some of those scenarios. So thanks so much for your attention. Here are the references.